Hi, my name is Jayson Elliott. I am an attorney with Bay Legal in California, and my associate Sivendra is joining us today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sivendra Maraj. I'm an associate attorney at Bay Legal, and today we're going to talk to you a little more about immigration.
Okay, so let's talk about the immigration application process. Sivendra, why do so many immigration applicants get denied even when they're otherwise qualified for the visa they're applying for?
So a lot of people, they assume that if they qualify for an immigration benefit, approval should be automatic, but immigration doesn't really work that way. So the USCIS, they're not just looking for whether you qualify in theory, they're looking for whether you properly proved it through an application and documentation. So sometimes someone actually does meet the requirements, but a key document is missing, a form was filled out incorrectly, or evidence doesn't clearly support what you're claiming. And unfortunately, immigration officers don't fix those mistakes for you. If something important is missing or unclear, the entire petition can be delayed or even denied. So that's why preparation and documentation are so important when it comes to immigration cases.
So last night, before we started the podcast, I was mentioning to you that last night when I got home, my wife was watching 90 Day Fiancé on TV as background noise. And I'm not an immigration attorney, so that's kind of my introduction to the fiancé visa. But what are some of the biggest mistakes couples make when they're applying for that marriage visa or marriage green card?
So one of the biggest mistakes people make is that they treat the process just like it's a set of forms to fill out, right? Because initially that's kind of what it feels like, but the whole process itself, a marriage green card case, it isn't really about paperwork. It's about proving that the marriage is genuine. So immigration officers, they're sitting in a building, they're trained to look at these documents, pieces of paperwork, and they're trained to look for real evidence that the couples are building a life together. That means things like shared finances, living arrangements, any kind of travel or memories together, communication history, the kinds of things that real couples naturally accumulate over time. If an application only includes the bare minimum, just the forms and payment, that's really not enough because there's not enough strong supporting evidence. So questions are naturally going to be raised. So the goal is not just submitting the paperwork, which of course that is important. It's telling the story of the relationship through the documentation you provide.
While you're talking, I'm kind of thinking about the divorce process. And
Yeah.
nobody's really checking if you're unhappy, that you just fill out the paperwork and they assume the marriage is over. You're just going through the process now. So this is kind of the opposite of that. Even though you're filling out the paperwork, you kind of have to prove that you're actually married, or at least not married yet, but you're in that relationship. You're in it, as they say, in it to win it. It's not just fill out the documents, go to the hearing, be done with it.
No, and things are very scrutinized. Like you said, unlike the divorce process, it's just like, we don't like each other anymore, we call it quits and be done with it. That's not how this is at all. This is something where you generally have to prove that this is a real relationship and we want to enter into it for real reasons, not just to obtain a visa or an immigration benefit.
Let's talk about completeness, about that documentation that is the basis before we get into, is the relationship real? Why do some people just get stuck in this process for years and years? We've talked about this a lot, and sometimes two couples that look similar in their relationship with you, one could take years and the other can move through fairly quickly.
Yeah.
Kind of talk about the documentation completeness.
So immigration is one of those things where it's a long-term projection that you're looking at. It's never going to be a quick process usually. And what you need to do is try to push that process along as smoothly as you can and as efficiently as you can. Any little hurdles or mistakes that you encounter or that you make along the way, those are things that can make huge delays. So sometimes delays will happen simply because immigration processing times are long. That is a very normal part of the process because this is a long-term game that you're playing. But in many cases, the delays actually happen because something in your original paperwork created the complications that you're encountering. So for example, someone might file the wrong type of petition, they might submit incomplete information, or they might miss an important deadline or appointment. That's pretty common actually, but you want to make sure that you're on top of things because If any of those type of things occur, the case can get stuck in a cycle of requests for evidence, corrections, or even having to start the process over again, depending on how detrimental the mistake was. So immigration law is kind of one of those things where it's very procedural. Any tiny mistake that you make early on in the process can add months or even years to the entire case. So it's really important that you approach immigration with clear strategy from the start.
Okay, so yesterday in the afternoon, you had a couple client consults, and we were talking about one of them. I believe they're a student working on their second master's degree, and
Yes.
you said their only option to stay was if they pursued a PhD, and that's a long application process. I guess because this is such a long process, maybe talk a little bit about the importance of thinking ahead, planning ahead, even if you're already in the U.S. And I think this was somebody that was on a student visa.
Even coming from my own background as an international student in the US, there's a lot of things that you have to keep in mind when you are doing anything really as you're a student here. One of the big things is planning ahead. Application processes for schools and education in general tend to take a long time. So that's one thing that you have to keep in mind. But there's a lot of other things that you have to keep in mind as well, such as traveling. One thing you should be very careful about is traveling while you're on a visa outside of the US without first understanding the consequences that potentially you could have regarding your immigration status. Depending on what your history is with immigration, leaving the country can sometimes trigger what's called a re-entry bar. That can prevent you from returning to the US. So you have to be really careful, especially when you're a student. That is even more so the case because you have a lot of different strict requirements regarding your enrollment and your travel and work and things like that. The tricky part is that a lot of people don't really realize what those issues are or what those requirements are until it's too late. And so they assume they can just kind of do whatever they want as a normal citizen would in the US and not have any issue, which is not the case at all because immigration, they look very closely at things like overstays and unlawful presence and things like that. So regarding travel or even regarding just making your plan or your decisions, it's really important to understand how the process works from the beginning. I think that's where we come back to with all of these topics is that it really matters what you do from the start. It's not just something you can just go online, fill out the paperwork one day and figure, you're good to go just by filling that out. You actually have to make a plan where this is going to go, make an outline, figure out what it's going to be from step to step.
Would I be right in the assumption that, this process is long and maybe part of the reason it's a multi-year process is from that time they grant your first visa or even before, they're kind of watching you. So these things like traveling outside of the country, what you do while you're here, all go into that final decision.
Yeah,
I'm just assuming that, but...
No, I think you're 100% right. What I like to usually say is that immigration comes down to consistency and preparation. So if you're consistent from many years beforehand, that it's not just one day you're here for the immigration process and you're ready to do it, but instead you've been showing that throughout the years you've built it in the case of a marriage situation, you have been preparing this relationship for a number of years. Now you're at the point where you're ready to apply for the visa, but you have all that proof, whether it's been a year, a few months, whatever it may be, you have that foundation or that relationship. So it's not just that it appeared one day and now you're starting to prove it, right? Because that kind of looks a little weird.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Makes sense to me. Let's move a little bit back towards that 90-day TV show, just because it's something that's fun to watch. The marriage, the eventual marriage, a lot of times follows a visa, but I guess what I'm trying to ask is why do immigration officers deny the spouse's applications even when they're married to a U.S. citizen already? Why isn't that just an automatic approval?
So some people do think that it automatically gives legal status when you marry a U.S. citizen. I don't know if that's just a Hollywood kind of thing or like we see in shows like 90 Day Fiancé. I think actually they do a pretty good job at showing the difference between the Hollywood interpretation of getting a visa and all that versus the reality. I think they actually do show a good balance because immigration law doesn't work that easily. unfortunately. Marriage can sometimes make you eligible to apply for a green card, but eligibility and approval are two different things. So if you're in an application process, you have to show you meet all those legal requirements. You have to show that the relationship was real, that you entered legally, that you're admissible, and then just really that the marriage is genuine, the relationship is genuine and consistent, like we talked about. So if there are any kind of prior violations or missing documents, there can be denials, there can be delays. So marriage, it can open the door to immigration benefits. And I think that's something they try to address in 90 Day Fiancé, that when you get married to a US person, you have that opportunity to apply for certain visas, get the process rolling, but it doesn't automatically complete the process just by getting married and doing the initial paperwork.
So it's the key, but it's not the final approval.
Exactly. It just opens the pathway.
So we just talked about leaving and the consequences of leaving the country while you're in the process. What about overstaying? Why do some people lose their chance at that eventual green card without even realizing it?
And I think this one is even more key than not realizing you're not supposed to be here, right? The fact that you're already here, if you overstay, it can be really detrimental. And I think a lot of people don't realize it because they don't realize how important it is, that these requirements are in place for a reason. And a lot of the times people unintentionally hurt their immigration options or the pathways available to them just because they fully don't understand how immigration status works. For example, if you overstay on a visa or you start working without authorization, that can create a lot of complications further along in the process. In some cases, the violations can actually trigger penalties and actually bar you from certain immigration pathways. The hard part, like we talked about, is that a lot of people don't realize what they're doing until it is too late. And eventually they're trying to apply for a green card, and that whole history comes up, right? Where they're looking at many years before. It's not that they're tracking you, but kind of they're looking at your pattern and your history. And if it's noted that you've overstayed or had some kind of violation, that's going to come up. It's not just that it goes away. And that's why understanding the immigration status early on and maintaining it when possible is so important. I think that in our example of being a student, this is really crucial, actually, because a lot of the times if you're an international student in the US, your US citizen friends, they might be staying over at break or they might be having jobs off campus. That's something that a lot of international students figure that they can just do the same as their US counterparts, when a lot of the times there are more heavy restrictions in place. So it's important to understand.
So we've talked about leaving while you're in the process. We've talked about overstaying while you're in the process. What's the biggest mistake that can delay your immigration for months or even years?
So there's two things: incompleteness and inconsistency. So a lot of the times, this is a lot of paperwork, right? And from my own experience doing this for myself, when I became a first a permanent resident, then a citizen, and even before that, a student, there's a lot of paperwork and there's a lot of instructions. But from my experience, it's not always easy to find and reconcile those two things. And so one common mistake is submitting an application that's incomplete or inconsistent. And a lot of the times it's not even on purpose or anything like that. A lot of times it's just by mistake. Immigration applications, they require a lot of detailed information about your history. I mean, they'll ask you for 5 years of your addresses or employment, travel, status, that sort of thing. And that's going usually 5 years or more. And I don't know about you, but for me, when I was in university, I switched around different apartments, and sometimes I didn't know all the different apartment numbers and things like that. So I had to go back and do a lot of searching to find that information to make sure it was complete. And then even going a little further along the process, you have to make sure you're consistent, because although you said all that information in one form, they ask it in other forms too. And I think it is to make sure that people are being consistent. If the information in the forms don't line up with prior filings or supporting documents, immigration officers can often issue what is called a request for evidence. It kind of puts a halt on the process while the applicant gathers additional proof or whatever they're missing. So even small inconsistencies can slow things down significantly, which is why I think accuracy from the beginning is so important when providing and preparing these applications. I think in immigration and even other types of law too, but specifically immigration, it really matters what you're doing from the beginning and even before the beginning.
I remember when I was applying for the bar, they wanted 10 years of addresses. And I had lived
Exactly.
overseas, gone to school
Yeah.
overseas. So what I did was I set up a spreadsheet with dates and put it all in there. So every
Yeah,
time they
that's smart.
asked something, every time that I had the right date, because it took me maybe even 2-3 weeks to put it all together. I had to reach out
Oh,
to
yeah.
friends and people I went to school with and say, hey, what apartment number did we live in? Those sorts of things. So I think you want to probably keep your own record really clean. Just from my experience in other areas and doing background checks for different things, you want to keep your own record so you don't accidentally put May when it was April on some random document and then throw a wrench into your whole process. We've already addressed several times that this process, whatever stage you're in, is a long process. Why do immigration cases sometimes get denied at those steps towards the end, after years of waiting and maybe even being already into one or two steps in those stages?
So a strong foundation is crucial. Immigration decisions are often based on the strength of the original petition that was filed years earlier. And so if the case was submitted with weak documentation or any kind of missing evidence or incomplete evidence, those issues can surface, sometimes not at the preliminary stages, but they might become a problem much later on in the process when the officer at the end finally reviews everything and they see a deficiency in the file. By that point, the officer, they're evaluating the record that was created at the beginning of the case, even though it's much later on in the process. So even though you might have waited years to hear back or the outcome is still in limbo, it really depends heavily on how well the case is documented from the start. That's why, again, going back to the beginning, we need to build that strong foundation. Because if it's not there, it might not crumble tomorrow or it might not crumble along the first step of the process, but by the end of the case, it might become so weak and the deficiencies are pointed out so carefully and scrutinized so heavily that eventually it crumbles, and that's when you get issues or denials later on in the process.
Let's go on to basically sources of information. Why shouldn't you rely on advice from friends or social media for your immigration matters?
So immigration, just like a lot of other areas of law, it's not one size fits all. It's very fact specific. So although you might see your friends posting online or different people talking about their immigration path or their situation, two people might have seemingly very similar situations, but there might be small differences in the immigration history that can lead to completely different outcomes. Advice from any friends, online forums, social media, it's often based on somebody's personal experience or experiences that they've heard of, not necessarily the rules that'll apply in your situation. And unfortunately, if we take that advice as gold, it can lead us down a wrong path. And if we start down the wrong path, sometimes it's very hard or sometimes even impossible to correct it. So we want to avoid those missteps from the beginning. We want to make sure we're getting the correct advice up front. So even though it's natural to look for guidance from people we trust or think that we trust, immigration decisions should always be based on accurate legal advice that applies to your specific situation.
So my last question is, why do immigration lawyers say that documentation is everything?
Even from your perspective, right, you've listened to these things and we've discussed these things kind of in great detail. And what it comes down to is documentation. In immigration law, it's not enough to simply say something is true. You actually have to prove it with evidence, because the officers are not just going to take your word for it, right? The officers that are reviewing your file, they don't know you. They're relying on what you tell them to use in their analysis. And that could include things like identity documents, financial records, travel records, relationship evidence, employment records, and a bunch of other stuff. But really, you have to prove your case and you have to show them what your situation is all about, because they don't know you. The stronger and more clear that your documentation is, it's going to translate to the process being easier, at least for the immigration officer that's evaluating your case. And when you make their job easy, it's more likely that they're going to assist you in a way that helps to push things along a little smoother, right? If they feel that they don't understand what's going on, if they're confused, then it's more likely that they'll request more evidence, which delays the process, as we discussed. So when immigration lawyers say documentation is everything, what they really mean is that the strength of your case and really the outcome can depend on what you prove, not just what you say.
So keep good records. Don't make mistakes. Keep things consistent. That's it for this one. I think the next week we're going to be doing family immigration, family visas.
Yeah.
So please join us for that one, and have a good week.